it was hokey, and it shouldn't have meant much. But there were just a few of us that they would hang that thing on, and I was one.
Mystic, Connecticut, the home of the Mystic Seaport and Whaling Museum. This picturesque village on the Mystic River has been home to Boston Marathon legend Johnny J. Kelley for over 50 years. Also known as Johnny Kelley the Younger. He won the Boston Marathon in 1957 after 11 years of foreign dominance. On the 50th anniversary of his historic win, producer Steve DiPolito and writer Roger Zotti visited Kelley at his store in the Old Mystic Village, where he reminisced about the people and events of that decade from 1953 to 1963, where he was considered America's best marathoner. John Joseph Kelley was born on Christmas Eve, 1930. As a high school track star at Buckley High School in New London, he ran the fastest high school mile in the country for the year 1949 at 4 minutes and 21 seconds. This earned him a scholarship to Boston University, where he trained to run the mile for BU. However, he also yearned to run the Boston Marathon. While still in high school, Kelley and his friend George Terry ran in the 1949 race. While Terry finished 23rd, Kelley failed to finish. Kelley eventually convinced his BU track coach to allow him to train for and compete in the 1953 Boston Marathon. We begin by Kelley remembering the two people who would be his biggest supporters, his wife Jessie and Boston Athletic Association trainer Jock Semple.
As I look back on it, I would say of my wife, who died 3 years ago, and I was married 50 years, that she was an extremely supportive person. I don't think you could have found a better. She wasn't a runner initially, but she latched right onto the game when she figured this little nut was going to stay with it, I mean me. And if she was going to go with him, she better sure as hell find out about this curious thing. So she got into it at the end of her life. She was more knowledgeable than I was, because by that time I'd passed my prime and my attentions were diverted. I didn't race anymore, not really competitively.
John Duncan Semple, better known as Jock, was a top marathon runner in the 1930s who later became an athletic trainer in the old Boston Garden. He is perhaps best known for his attack on Kathy Switzer during the 1967 marathon. He attempted to grab the race number pinned to her during the race after she had entered the marathon illegally, as women were forbidden from running the Boston Marathon until 1972. However, Jock was a true lover of the sport who insisted on protecting the integrity of the Boston Marathon. Kelley remembers the man who would become like a second father to him.
He loved the persona that he created. He knew intuitively that if he was going to win a name that went beyond his own lifetime, it was going to be for the things that he did, be it attempting to block Kathy Switzer out of the 1967 marathon, or insisting upon these standards that, and telling vocally, disparaging people who try to break through without making the standards. And he would be guilty of the worst kind of political incorrectness, speaking of such people, but he didn't care, because he knew that the people who really knew him knew that he was all heart, and he loved the game, see. And he really didn't hate anybody. He just wanted to come on as a terror, because he was a Scottish terror. That was his image. And if he wasn't that, he wouldn't have been Jock. But he loved the game, and he loved the people in it. It was so easy for him to be outrageous, he didn't even have to twitch a muscle to say something completely offensive to somebody. Like a guy would come up to him, I remember this exactly as it happened. A guy came up to him for a special entry into some race that had already closed its field. And Jock said, he looked at him and he said, and Jess borrowed this and she used it for the rest of her life. She was standing there. It was so funny to her. He says, get out of here. You can't run fast enough to work up a sweat on the 4th of July. And that was the way he dismissed the guy. So Jess would always tell somebody, you can't run fast enough to work up a sweat on the 4th of July.
During this time, running, as an Olympic sport, was governed by a strict code of amateurism. To accept a cash prize or anything of monetary value could have resulted in the runner being banned from international competition for life.
I won a 10-mile race, and among other prizes, there was a pair of shoes, not athletic shoes, but $35 Florsheim shoes, which I thought, my God, I can teach school in those things. So I took them. They were just my size. And a fellow from the New England AAU tapped me on the shoulder and he said, Johnny, he said, you hope to make the Pan American team next year. He says, if it gets out that you've taken the prize with a real worth exceeding $30, I think it was, he said, you could lose your amateur status. And I actually acquiesced, because it was more important for me to make that team than it was to take the $35 pair of teaching shoes.
All right.
Now it seems so laughable, Roger, but in context, you see, it was a serious business for us, because we were told from the beginning, if you want to run, you have to do something else. You know, you can be a teacher, you can run and be a teacher, you can run and be an engineer, you can run and haul garbage, but you make your living doing one thing, and you run for pure enjoyment.
Kelley and friends George Terry and Nick Costas, America's only hopes, were among a small group of runners in America who trained for the marathon. Since its inception at the 1896 Olympics, the Olympic marathon was not taken seriously by most American runners who excelled at track events.
My friend Nick Costas, who passed away 3 years ago, used to say, when they called him that, America's lonely dope, because in those days there were only about 200 people in the whole country running marathons, and all the rest thought we were completely batty.
The friends were all inspired by the great Czechoslovakian runner Emil Zakopek, perhaps the greatest runner who ever lived. He revolutionized training, and the young Americans adopted his methods into their own training programs.
Emil Zatopek, he had seen Zatopek run in Europe during that period, see. And Zatopek, of course, was this luminary. He had won 3 Olympic titles in 1952 in Helsinki, and nobody's had ever done that before. Nobody's done it since, and it's doubtful anybody ever will do it again, in the 5, the 10, and the marathon. But anyway, Zatopek was like a living god to us in that generation.
In 1953, Kelley ran Boston wearing a Boston University jersey. He finished 5th in the first serious attempt at the marathon in a race won by a 5'2" Japanese runner who finished in what was thought to be a world record time.
There was a brisk wind that day, but it was, you know, it was a northwest wind off our on our right shoulder. But Keizo Yamato won. He was a little guy. He's still running the marathon at 76, 77 years of age. He ran this year. And he won in 2:18 and change, and it was a new record that day. I hung with him for about a little past the halfway mark, you know, running even with him, but I was actually learning the game. It was the first race, Boston race, I actually finished. And I had started one in high school a few years earlier and dropped out. So I was quite elated to hang on and finish 5th that day. But I was 2:28, I think, 2:28 and change.
In 1954, Kelley finished 7th, running for the sponsoring Boston Athletic Association. It was a race in which Finn Varco Karvonen defeated world record holder Jim Peters of Great Britain. The following year, hopes were pinned on Nick Costas as Kelley was drafted into the Army and was unable to run. Costas finished 3rd, then predicted that when Kelley returned in 1956, he would be the boy to beat. In 1956, Kelley finished 2nd by 19 seconds in the world record time. However, the times were later determined to be invalid as measurement of the course found it to be nearly a mile short. It was later discovered that road construction throughout the 1950s had gradually shortened the course every year since 1951.
Antti Viskari from Finland, yeah, and he was a powerful runner. He was well-muscled runner, and we just had a hell of a go that day. And he and I ran together for 23 miles, and then he just inched away. But I never ran out of steam. He just had more steam than I had, see. So I don't know. There might have been 19 seconds separating us at the finish. And then it was the fastest race ever. And then, of course, they found out it was 2:14:11 for him or something like that. I don't know what it was. And like 2:14, I don't know. But I think it was about 19 seconds separating us.
It's simple.
But later on, they remeasured the course not long afterward and found out it was 1,120 yards short. So that was a kick.
Which year was that?
That was 56.
Right,
see. But if you projected that out, it still would have been 2:17 plus.
Kelley was now considered one of the best in the world and was on the 1956 Olympic team that competed in the Games in Melbourne, Australia. Kelley remembers the Olympic marathon in which, after leading the race for the first 15 miles, he fell victim to the brutal Australian sun.
Zatopek at the Olympic marathon start in Melbourne in 1956. It was about December 1st or 2nd. See, actually, we'd been there. Most of the teams had been there for a full month in training, and the weather has been in Melbourne, a southern city. You don't get real hot temperatures at all until summer really breaks, and it would be like April and May here when we were there through October, and at the end of October and through November. It was gray, overcast days, damp weather, a persistent southeast wind, and the southeast wind in Melbourne is right off the ocean, and it's also coming from the Antarctic region, so it's like a northeast wind here. But for a whole month we had practically overcast skies. And, we'd run in our warm-ups. I have a few pictures of us training at that time. And all of a sudden, the clouds were gone the day of the race. See, we had been laboring under cloudy skies right up until the last training day. And then we woke up that morning, and it was a blue dome above us. And the race started. I don't know what time it started. My recollection is that it started around 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'm not sure about that. But it was still early enough, so the sun hadn't really got as hot as it hadn't become nearly as hot as it would get. But all signs were it was going to be a hell of a scorcher. And we were on the track, and the sun was just rising above the stadium. And Zatopek was looking at us. He was a funny guy. He could speak about 7 languages. And he says, and he made a big grin, and he says, "Today we die." And funny about him, he finished 5th, I think, that day, only weeks after a hernia operation, or an appendectomy, maybe?
Right,
appendectomy.
Yeah, that's
appendectomy.
But you kind of, you took the lead and suffered.
Well, I went out, we did some stupid stuff, but, you do so many stupid things. I can't believe it. Somebody said, well, you're going to have plenty of salt in your system because you're going to sweat a lot. You'll take a lot of liquids and you're going to sweat them out. But don't forget to get enough salt. I don't know who the hell told us that, but it was probably one of the worst bits of advice we ever acted upon. We ate onion soup for breakfast that morning. And you know how salty that is?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it was just, I started taking liquids on early, but it didn't, it was just like this stuff was pouring through me. But, yeah, and at 24-mile mark that day, I remember, I had broken into an alternating walk and run, jog over the last 6 miles. And by the time I got to 24 miles, they had the last refreshment stand there. And supposedly everybody in the field there was a little flag of each country. And you were supposed to reach behind your flag to take what you had requested to have put out for you. It had to be a legal drink. But you could request a legal drink, like I had requested orange juice, for example. And so, but by the time I got to that table, it was just a disarray of spilled stuff all over the place, as people in this, as Nick said, zombified state had been grabbing for anything they could get, knocking the flags over, and the table was awash with a mix of juice and coffee and you name it. And I grabbed something up that I thought was going to be water, dumped it over my head, and it was scalding hot black coffee. So that sealed my fate.
Kelley briefly considered retiring after the Olympic failure, but was encouraged again by old friend George Terry to give Boston another shot in 1957.
Well, yeah, I came back from that. I thought to myself, oh, God, that's crazy. You can't keep doing this. I had been so keyed up for it, and I thought I was going to do well. And then when the whole thing crashed, I said, oh, God, you don't want to do that to yourself again. Get out of this crazy game. So I was going to retire, and I retired when I came home in December of '56. But my friend George Terry was persistently trying to win the Boston Marathon, and we trained together. And at that time, we were sharing a house together in Groton. So we go out in the morning on Shinnecock Golf Course, and all through the winter of early '57. And George pep talked me into keeping going, giving Boston one more try, see. So I said, oh, okay, do it once more. But I got into the mantra of the training program, and so, and it turned out that day I had run a couple of preliminary races, 10-milers, 12-milers in Boston, and I had done very well in them, and I thought to myself, well, why not? Maybe Melbourne was a fluke. And as things turned out, everything worked that day.
Kelley beat the Finn Karvonen, a 1954 winner. He gives much credit for his own win to support he received from the other Kelley, Johnny A. Kelley, known as Kelley the Elder. He won Boston 1935 and 1945.
Pretty much as popularly cast, it was a father-son kind of thing. And I got into the game when John was just 40 years old, and I was 16. And, he took me under his wing. He kept me going. I stayed at his house. Jess and I stayed at his house, his fiancée, wife Julie's mother's house in Belmont, the night before I won the marathon. And, it was very close. And John, sharing a name, it was just an unusual thing. And a lot of people just thought we were father and son, and, you let go with that. 57 race.
57, yeah. 57.
John had a reporter brother. He had a family of about 8 siblings, and one of them was a well-placed reporter on one of the Boston newspapers, so he said, get the word out. We don't want any calls coming into this house the night before the race. Well, it worked, except for one guy who called in. And John just jumped up from the table and he took the call. He said, sit there. So I heard him say, no, he isn't. If he was, I wouldn't tell you. Why'd you call here? And he hung up. No, he didn't miss any words. He came back to the table and he said, kid, someday you're going to learn that the worst combination in this world is ignorance and arrogance, or arrogance and ignorance. I don't know which came first.
Kelley went on to represent America in the 1960 Olympics and other international competitions. In 1959, he won the marathon at the Pan American Games. Perhaps his greatest achievement was his winning the National AAU Marathon at Yonkers, New York, 8 years in a row, beginning in 1956, certifying him as America's best marathoner. Kelley remembers the pressures of international competition.
You say to yourself, well, gee, maybe if they beat the drum on this one, and when Boston comes around, the papers and all the radio and television people have said, hey, this guy's the national chance to win this race. There's a lot incumbent upon you then. You place enormous pressure on yourself, and that's part of the neurosis of being a runner, I think. You don't see things clearly at all. You don't see that you're just doing this for nothing except for whatever, obscure enjoyment you may be taking in it. You don't owe anybody anything. But once you get into that level, onto that level, when I say that level, I mean when you become a contender for international teams and they put a red, white, and blue shield on your jersey, then you feel some responsibility to the people that sent you there.
Kelley went on to have a career teaching English and coaching cross country at Fitch High School in Groton, Connecticut. One of the students he coached, Amby Burfoot, became the next American winner at Boston with his victory in 1968. Kelley left teaching in 1980 to focus on being a freelance writer. As our visit comes to a close, Kelley shares some final thoughts about life after his competitive running career.
It has fired me with enthusiasm to be physically active, and even though I don't race anymore and my goals have shifted, from winning a marathon to surviving another day on planet Earth, which actually is everybody's goal without realizing it from day one. But the thing is, I think running has been a very big plus in my life. One day I was having an argument with somebody years ago, and that person got angry with me and said, Kelley, running is both the best and the worst thing that ever happened to you. And like many barbs that stick in your skin, it stayed with me for a long time, and I had to reflect on that. And I thought, well, that accusation had a lot of truth in it. Because when I was young, I sought to define my life by running. When I became older, I sought to define it in other ways, as if to say, this one thing isn't me. And it isn't. No one thing is anybody, I think. But you have to admit the importance of a certain thing in your life. And I think running has been an important, shaping factor in my life.